Well, good morning. Today is Friday, April 3rd, and I wanted to point out the day that we are taping this webinar here with SCbio. I am Erin Ford, Executive Vice President here at SCbio, because so much is changing on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, as we all battle COVID-19. And now is the time like no other that the life science industry is really coming to the forefront as we offer solutions for folks that are being affected worldwide by this pandemic. And we at SCbio are a state affiliate of the National Bio Association, which represents the biotechnology industry, and also AdvaMed, which represents the medical device industry. So we are privileged today to have both Phyllis, author, VP of Infectious Diseases and Diagnostic Policy with the Bio Organization, and Andy Fish, who is Chief Strategy Officer with AdvaMed, joining us today, taking time out of their very busy schedules to have us understand what is happening from Washington, D.C., and what their organizations are doing to help all of us in this crisis. And a little bit about Phyllis, as she is going to start us off. In her role, she's responsible for working with member companies in vaccines, molecular diagnostics, and biodefense on policy, legislative, and regulatory issues. Prior to joining Bio, Phyllis worked in numerous marketing and sales positions for Merck in their vaccine division. Over a 16-year career in vaccines, Phyllis launched several exciting new vaccines in the U.S. and internationally, including the first HPV vaccine, Gardasil. So both I want to thank Phyllis and Andy for joining us. And Phyllis, if you could start us off with what you're seeing happening and how Bio is responding and working with others amidst this crisis.
Still, I think. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Erin, so much for inviting me to join this webinar. This is a great opportunity to connect with our state affiliates. Everybody's working so hard on these issues, and so it's great to share a little bit about what Bio is working on. I have a few slides to share. I realized that what I didn't put in the slides actually was some of the legislative activities, so maybe we can just chat about those when we're in the Q&A section. So I just want to talk with folks about our Bio Coronavirus Collaboration Initiative. This is something we started in February, March at the request of our board of directors, who really saw this as an important global public health emergency, and as Erin really just said, an opportunity for the life sciences industry, represented here by all of us, to respond, to really be a core part of not just the response itself, but the recovery of our country, getting people back on their feet, getting people healthy, and getting people back to work and back to everything they have to do. Next slide. So the initiative actually has several focuses, but the core focus of the initiative is doing activities at Bio that'll help accelerate the research and development of the products that we all need, be they products to treat, products to give short-term prevention protection to healthcare workers and emergency management folks, or the longer-term products we'll need like vaccines, particularly if we think that this coronavirus is one that we're going to see routinely or over the next few years or even from now on. So we actually had last week a summit. It was a virtual summit, which was an interesting exercise for us as well. Everyone's trying this out. And we put together a plenary session. Hopefully some of you were able to attend it. Had great remarks from key government leaders, Ambassador Birx, who you're seeing on TV, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, Dr. Kadlec, really just talking about the fact that the industry is a key part of the response, and they're counting on all of us to bring these products to market that everyone needs. There were members from the press there, and it did have some global attendees, which we're really pleased about. But the most important part of the summit after that was actually 3 breakout sessions where we dug into, with companies as well as other stakeholders from government and NGOs, into the issues that are affecting our industry's ability to go fast. Obviously, everyone was talking about funding companies have novel and innovative ideas and they're looking for funding from governments or NGOs, and certainly venture capital. But there were also some shared challenges that people were facing in terms of standing up their clinical trials, getting quicker information from the US government on the scientific data around the disease. What are the issues of reinfection? How quickly what's the incidence of the varying different sequelae from having COVID-19? Things that would help you build clinical trials that can be definitive and give a clear view of efficacy and safety, both in treating and preventing COVID-19. And then there was actually a great discussion as well in the diagnostics breakout about the transition from lab-based tests to point-of-care diagnostics. The summit was happening right when some of the really great novel innovations were happening with many of the companies in diagnostics, getting us to some of the new ones that are point of care. There was a discussion about how we can go faster in diagnostics in the future through investments in platforms that you can kind of drop a different assay on if you need for a new disease. How can we go faster in the future with diagnostics? And I think that Andy will certainly talk about some of the work they're doing on that. And it was a great opportunity to just discuss this with a lot of our different thought leaders. So the next steps for us were actually to take these the things that came out as the shared challenges and start to share them with the federal agencies and partners and see if we can compress the time that information gets shared from the federal government and infectious disease leaders with industry, if we can compress the time that clinical trial results get shared across our industry so people understand what's working and what's not, and if we compress the time that funding can be available and use some of the different tactics that are sitting inside BARDA and NIH to get more money to more companies for innovative, disruptive technologies that could be brought to bear on not just this outbreak or this pandemic, but the next one. So part of this is we have to be thinking about the future. And if we can learn as much as we can about some of these novel technologies, we'll be faster the next time. And I think one thing we all learned from going from SARS to Ebola to Zika to MERS is there will be a next time for sure. So these are the kind of things we're trying to focus on. I want to leave you with one other thing that we knew we needed, which was a place for people to congregate around sharing their needs for certain materials, but also their needs for partners. And that's the thing we heard most clearly as well, is the need for partnering in this virtual world, and how can we facilitate that? So what we created was the Coronavirus Hub. And if you go to the next slide, I just have a little information on that. So we've got a lot of communications activity going on. I think all of us are trying to talk about the role of our industry. But more importantly, we launched this hub, which you can see the site there, and it does several things. It actually has a landing page where you can actually talk about contributions that all of our companies are making. So we're trying to connect to all the companies and all the work they're doing, the press releases, et cetera, so you can go there and find information on what everyone's working on. But more importantly, there's a resource center there. So you can go there and as a company, find information on best practices for business continuity. What are the travel policies? How do I deal with work from home? How do I make sure that in my state, my essential employees like lab workers and manufacturing people are designated as essential? These kinds of business continuity issues are super important. Secondly, we have a one page literally capturing, we think, almost all the global funding opportunities out there. So Gates Foundation, SCbio, BARDA, NIH, we're putting the European Union things on there, a place you can go to see where there's funding for your key area. And then lastly, there's what we're calling the kind of Craigslist hub, where you can put in that you need supplies or resources, or you're looking for a consultant to help you put together your regulatory package, or you're looking for a partner for scale up and manufacturing capacity. If you go to the next slide, I'll just show you a quick shot. So you go to the Coronavirus Hub within the bio site, and then there's 3 different drop-down boxes for R&D funding, the services, and the Coronavirus Hub. And inside the hub on your right-hand side, you'll see these are the different areas where you can look for partners or services or supplies, and you build an account and you go through, and if you're looking for a partner to work on research and development, you click there, and very much like the partnering system we have at Bio, build your profile and start to connect with people who might want to work with you on something. So we're trying to stand up something quicker than just our partnering system to help people connect and collaborate. That's really the core of our work on this at Bio. I think the other thing we're doing, of course, is continuing to interface with Congress and make sure that in all these packages, there's key things that foster life sciences innovation. And that's one of the core things we think are very important in all the different supplementals. Besides just the funding for BARDA and NIH, it's also facilitating the process. So thank you, Erin. That's a short bit of work on what we're doing at Bio in terms of COVID-19 response.
Well, that's great, Phyllis. I appreciate that. And we do have a link to the hub on our page on SCbio focused on the coronavirus. And we have directed many people to that. As you might imagine, on the state levels, there's so much innovation, even at the state levels, from large companies and small companies here. And having that partnership is so key. And so thank you for that overview of what Bio is working on. And Andy, I'm just going to read a little bit about you before we get an overview from you. You're the Chief Strategy Officer of AdvaMed, leading trade association, as I mentioned, advancing medical technology in the U.S. and around the world. And in your role, you lead the association's strategic planning, oversee AdvaMed's global regulatory and payment departments. You coordinate the development, operations, and policy work of AdvaMed's membership sectors, as well as AdvaMed's Center for Digital Health. And you have an extensive background in this industry, an impressive record of solving high-stakes challenges and complex intersections of regulated businesses, healthcare, science, technology, law, media, and politics. It all factors in, right, when we're in this crisis. So Andy, if you would, give us an overview of what AdvaMed is doing and how you're working with others in this crisis.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. And Erin, thanks for hosting us. Phyllis, thank you for your presentation. Great work on part of you and your colleagues across your industry. That's fantastic. So what I want to do is just kind of talk through a number of key areas that AdvaMed's working on, kind of how we're doing that. And because it's a lot of different areas, I'm not going to go too deep on any one thing, but I'd be really looking forward to questions and discussion. And I hope everyone's doing well and your families are all healthy as well. It's a tough time for all. So I guess, I'll start first with kind of how AdvaMed has organized our COVID-19 work. I won't belabor that point, but perhaps most importantly to point out that we also have set up a resource center. It's members only at this point. Obviously, we're putting some information on the public-facing side of our site, but we've got a lot of materials on our website, a COVID-19 resource center for members. And we're continuing to push out new information there all the time to help our members keep up to date with what's going on across multiple agencies and industry-wide. So all of you are, have some familiarity with the medical technology industry. Some of you are in our industry, obviously, and you know that our member companies make the equipment and supplies that are right on the front lines along with healthcare workers. So ventilators, most of our companies, or most of the ventilator companies are members, PPE manufacturers, diagnostic test companies, right? So our industry kind of covers everything that's at the center of the COVID-19 response. We've got a number of different work streams stood up. We already had, obviously, regulatory and payment focused work groups. They are now spending most of their time focused on COVID-19. We've stood up some additional work streams around supply chain, starting to dig more into PPE now. We've got a ventilators work group, obviously has been spun up for a number of weeks now. And we've got a chief medical officers group that we're reinvigorating. And so, and then a number of other groups that I won't list them all, but the point is that we are covering every facet of this challenge that we can for our members and working with them on a daily basis to interface with the relevant government agencies and other stakeholders to just get on top of this challenge absolutely as fast as possible. So I'll tick off some of the specific areas and just kind of summarize some of the things that are going on. Obviously, diagnostic testing, the very most forward piece of technology that needed to be brought to bear on this, and a lot of that, of course, a lot of that progress is public knowledge. FDA has now approved, I think, about 25 tests under EUAs. Many of those developed, of course, by our member companies. So we've been working very closely with FDA to ensure that our companies know what they need to be doing to expedite those EUAs, encouraging FDA to be as flexible as possible to make sure these tests get out there. Our company is, of course, now scaling up towards the millions of tests and pushing those out. For those of you who know even just a little bit about the diagnostics industry, you know that a lot of our companies have high throughput machines installed at hospital laboratories and other big reference laboratories around the country. So once these tests are approved, they can ship a lot of test kits out there and help hospitals run hundreds, if not thousands, in some cases, of tests per day. So that's really stepped up in a big way now. And I would note that FDA just yesterday approved the first serology test. That's a test looking for antibodies. We can talk more about that. It's a fascinating issue regarding surveillance and epidemiology around this. A personal interest of mine, so I won't go into it very much more, but I'm happy to take questions, and Phyllis probably have some thoughts on that as well. But the availability, wider spread availability of serology tests is going to be really key to understanding, getting a better understanding of how this epidemic was spreading in the first place, where it is now. And there's a lot of discussion around kind of the infected well, if you will, asymptomatic folks who are out there spreading the disease unknowingly. So that whole testing area is obviously huge. We have a whole diagnostics division. Some of you may be familiar with that. And so focused 100% on deploying tests. On the ventilator space, obviously this is critical. You'll see this in the news constantly, is where are our ventilators? Our companies have been ramping up production, absolutely maxing out everything they can do on this front. I think we're headed towards about a 10 times increase in production over what had been done over 2019. So that's a massive increase. It will continue. I'll stop here to mention the Defense Production Act, right? Something we've been tracking carefully. So so you've seen that the administration some weeks ago, the president rather, signed an executive order basically invoking his Defense Production Act authorities with regard to this pandemic without taking any specific steps at that point, and delegating most of that authority to HHS. The administration has been reluctant to bring too heavy a hand to bear, and we can talk more about that. Some people look at that through a political lens for sure. And there are a lot of questions around that. But the point is that initially, the administration didn't use its Defense Production Act for anything specific regarding this pandemic. It is used widely and regularly for other things, especially around defense logistics and supplies. But in this case, it wasn't really invoked until the administration did specifically invoke it with regard to GM and their production of ventilators. And then just yesterday, the administration issued a further order aimed at standing manufacturers, typical manufacturers of ventilators, including our companies. But it seems that policy, and I don't think we've seen much more guidance on exactly how that's intended to be implemented, but it was primarily aimed at ensuring that ventilator manufacturers have adequate supplies. So again, we don't know a lot of details, and I don't want to get ahead of where this might be headed, but our expectation is that that's really focused on, if needed, ensuring that there are adequate supplies of components for ventilators. Ventilators are pretty complex machines, and there's a lot of component parts. And obviously, our companies can only produce what they have supplies for. So stay tuned there. I'm happy to talk more about Defense Production Act stuff in questions. PPE production obviously is ramping up as well. 3M, one of our companies, is one of the major suppliers of masks. I know they've at least doubled their production of N95 masks. So obviously there's a lot of work going on in that space as well. I guess let me shift to policy a little bit. The CARES Act, really I think the third piece of legislation intended to address this pandemic, but obviously the biggest one to date, partly just in scope of money flowing, included a number of provisions specifically related to CMS policies, and some issues around telehealth, obviously issues about reimbursement and coverage for testing. A lot of stuff going on in that bill. Happy to talk a little more about that, but there were a number of provisions we were working on as that legislation was developed, and obviously prior to enactment. There was a provision in there specifically regarding shortage reporting of medical devices. So that's of interest, obviously, to our industry. We did a lot of work with FDA and Congress before that provision was passed. Then CMS itself, of course, is issuing various policy changes, interim policy changes, mostly intended to just be in place during this national health emergency. Perhaps one of those most notable ones is expansion of availability of telehealth and some relaxation restrictions around telehealth services. Obviously, we think that's critical. I could elaborate in questions on kind of even wider access to various digital health services that go beyond telehealth. But we were pleased to see what CMS has done so far. Also, partly as a side note, but you may have seen that CMS had put out some guidance on elective procedures. Basically, I think various hospital entities were asking for any guidance on how they should be thinking about what to defer and how to manage the provision of elective procedures as they were preparing to deal with, influx of COVID-19 patients. And so we did some work with the agency on that, primarily just, looking at that policy and making sure that we thought it was, kind of reasonable and wouldn't unduly inhibit procedures that could proceed. But really not intending to say that we were hugely influential in that, but that we were watching it pretty closely. I think some of that policy was driven by some of the surgical societies. So let me turn to, I guess, last in kind of this roundup before I stop and we take questions. Some interesting things going on around data and privacy and data and surveillance, right? So on the privacy side, the administration has put out over the last couple of weeks, a couple different policies regarding HIPAA and data privacy. And one of those was to specifically say that telehealth services could be provided on non-secure platforms, right? So normally you'd be using systems that were HIPAA compliant, but recognizing that telehealth now will be provided by doctors who are not in their facilities and with patients who aren't necessarily on HIPAA compliant systems. They specifically said, we're not going to enforce with regard to HIPAA violations for the use of Zoom or, FaceTime and these other platforms. They reminded everyone that they should use all the possible security features, but obviously they didn't want HIPAA to get in the way of people actually having access to care through telehealth. So that was great. Obviously, we're fully supportive. The administration at the same time was also putting out reminders around what HIPAA covers and reminding folks that HIPAA does not prevent covered entities, healthcare providers, for instance, from providing information to public health authorities that could be useful in responding to the epidemic. And then just yesterday, in a further move that we applauded because we've been wrestling with this, the administration further notified the industry that it would exercise enforcement discretion with regard to business associates, the entities that contract with healthcare providers. We can go into more details. A lot of our companies are business associates. They're serving healthcare systems and hospitals with regard to data collection, data analysis. Our companies have smart technologies embedded in hospital systems, collecting a lot of data. They can perform a lot of data analytics around where this disease is cropping up, what's going on a daily basis, hotspot identification. So there's a lot of services that our companies could provide to public health authorities, but under HIPAA, they can't do that without going back through the covered entities. And there's a number of other complications there, but the policy that HHS announced yesterday is pretty helpful in that regard, so we were pleased to see it. And then finally, there's a lot of interesting work going on that is not directly relevant to medical technology, but efforts in which I think a lot of our digital health data could be fed. And that's these wider efforts around surveillance and assessment of stay-at-home policies and how effective they are. You've probably seen some news reporting. There's a COVID-19 technology or a technology and research task force, something along those lines. Basically a volunteer effort stood up by a number of folks from the various big tech companies, working with public health authorities, working with public health experts at a number of the leading academic centers to figure out how aggregate data, I should caution to say, I don't think anyone's looking at personally identifiable data, but how aggregate data around cell phone movement, other social movement patterns can be used to figure out how effective stay-at-home policies are, and to the extent that stay-at-home policies are different in different places, how differentially effective they are, and if and when stay-at-home policies get lifted in various places, and mapping that against testing and COVID-19 spread and so forth. I think people are really looking to try to figure out how to get a really data-rich look at how these policies are affecting the spread of the pandemic. And then finally, we're a number of our companies are in fact doing work on the data and data analytics that they hold to try to provide more real-time information around spread of pandemic. And you might have seen news, for example, Medtronic announced that it was using some of its existing systems to try to make sure that patients could give real-time information like daily fever tracking and things like that into their healthcare providers and so forth. So there's a lot of work going on here. Obviously, it's evolving week by week. This is a lot of sort of development under fire, but there's just a huge amount going on in the data space. So that I probably didn't touch on everything, but I think that's plenty to give an overview of what we're working on.
That's really cool.
Love to take questions and talk further.
Sure. No, well, thank you, Andy, for that input. And there is so much that's going on, and with a variety, like I said, from digital health to data privacy to just the work that's being made with the ventilators and that ramping up of that technology. So, Phyllis, I'm going to start us off, and for those that are also on the webinar, at the bottom of your screen, you have an opportunity to ask questions, and so we have a few of those in. We'll try to get to them with the time that we're allotted. Phyllis, talk a little bit about even just the innovation that's happening on the vaccine side. You know, we read about Gilead and Johnson & Johnson in clinical trials. And so what are interesting things that you're seeing from that aspect?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of interesting work, and I may have actually included a couple slides that show timelines of how products are being developed, and maybe we can click on those. But as many of you know, there's products being aggressively evaluated in clinical trials on the vaccine and the therapeutic side. So this is something we put together very quickly. It's obviously such a moving target as so many products are in development, but you're seeing products starting to move. So some of the products are obviously the ones in phase 3 that you're hearing about. Regeneron's product, very exciting. Gilead's product, extremely exciting as well. And so there are products moving, and what you have to understand is companies are often doing these trials at the same time. They're doing phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials almost on top of each other. There are some very interesting technologies going on in the preclinical and soon to be phase 1 stage that might go after some of the unique issues of the more serious consequences of the disease. Products that are meant to handle the inflammation, see if they can actually be used both preventive for certain people, and then of course to treat patients that are already sick but not yet very, very ill, to keep them from getting very ill. So the therapeutics landscape is quite broad, and you'll see the various different kinds of products. A lot of interesting movement in this plasma-derived therapies space, which I think matches some of the work we saw for Ebola, where people were getting sera from people who had been infected and recovered and using that to develop certain kinds of therapies. So I think the breadth of products under development is indicative of the different kinds of technologies brought to bear on the various parts of the disease that need to be controlled for to hopefully keep people off of ventilators or get them off of them sooner. The second slide on the vaccine landscape is also very interesting. People have certainly heard that Moderna, a Boston-based company, is in phase 1 trials. They're already planning their phase 2 trials to be going on while they're doing their phase 1 trial. There's a whole bunch of companies that I think in the next month we will see go into phase 1, many of them with novel platform technologies that were used to respond to either Ebola or SARS and MERS in particular, so the other coronavirus pandemic potential pathogens we saw before. In particular, Sanofi, Johnson & Johnson, Inovio, Novavax, these companies all have said publicly that they'll be entering into phase 1 trials within the next month to 2 months. And I think that's important. These companies are also all trying to figure out how to do scale up, not just for the US, but globally. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in vaccines for the world, and the need to figure out how to invest or find capacity across the whole vaccine industry to make not thousands but millions and millions of doses relatively rapidly for a global response. Hopefully we see the peak in this disease, but knowing that there might be some opportunity for this to become a routine infection that we need to deal with means that we're going to need to find capacity for scale up on a global level. So very exciting work and some really interesting and unique technologies being applied on both the vaccine side and the therapeutic side.
Yes, well, thank you, Phyllis, for that information. It is interesting. And Andy, you had mentioned a lot on the technology side and just the data that's being captured. Obviously, we're focused on the now, though. How does this apply for, as we continue on, we find a solution now and then it's, it comes back. So can you talk a little bit about the long term and that important data?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. And, it's not all just from a medical technology perspective specifically. I'm really just pointing out that, that we have a number of companies. Just back up and make a quick comment on digital health, right? So, if you look at the transformation of the medical technology industry through the ability to embed sensors and collect more information and tie data together inside the hospital and outside the hospital, our companies increasingly are the ones who are actually generating patient data. That's a big shift over time, from having a technology that simply goes into a hospital and it just sits and it does something, or a technology that just goes into the body like an implant or something like that. So, but now we have, our companies developing systems that are collecting reams of data. Sometimes it's just more data of the type we've had before, and a lot of times it's novel data, right? We have the ability now to have sensors in the body. We've seen some deployment of that. I think over the next few years, we'll see a lot more deployment of that. There's some talk now about how you could have, relatively unobtrusive sensors in the body detecting early symptoms of COVID-19, whether it's fever spike, potentially other issues, right? So we're not there right now in terms of being able to deploy that quickly, but we can easily imagine that in the not too distant future, for a future pandemic, or perhaps even another go round here, that we could have a lot more people with sensors on board that would be communicating real time into health systems, or even a daily download, things like that. So we can envision using currently available technologies, that we could have a lot more data brought to bear, as time goes forward. But to speak more broadly about data in general on this, I think that right now, obviously, testing was slower to get ramped up in general that we'd like. A lot of that's been reported in the news, and I don't need to really cover it. But as we have both tests for COVID-19 itself now, obviously being much more widely deployed, and serology testing will be coming online, we'll have the ability to collect a whole lot more information about exactly how COVID-19 really, spread initially. We'll get a much better look at where it really is in the population. And I think all of that will help us prepare better for, as we hope doesn't happen, but very well might, another wave in the fall. A lot of concerns around what happens when you lift stay-at-home policies, because if you don't have serology testing, or COVID-19 testing, right? I think that's probably the COVID-19 more testing is more important for lifting these policies. But the basic point is, the more information we can collect on an epidemiological level, the better prepared we'll have to manage the next months of this disease. And of course, the next time there's a pandemic, and no one obviously now can have their head in the sand about the fact that we can be hit hard by something like this. So happy to elaborate, other questions. But
yeah. Well, thank you, Andy. And Phyllis, we're already sort of past our time. We actually are. So.
We are? Oh, okay.
Wow.
We can talk.
Dear. Okay.
I know for a long time, though, what I do think is important is to get just some final thoughts from both of you. As many of us in the industry are trying our best to contribute, also balancing that with what we see in the news. So sort of really from your perspective, what you think is important for us here in South Carolina that are in the life sciences industry, and those that may just be tuning in, learning more about it, that know from both of your perspectives. So Phyllis, some final thoughts.
I think that what's really important is that we continue to commit to innovating and putting forward disruptive, interesting ideas that could help us both in this outbreak and anything that happens in the future. And I think the good thing about that is we're going to learn so much about controlling different kinds of outcomes that has applicability to a host of diseases, not just responding to this outbreak, but what we're going to learn about how to control inflammation can be important for a host of different opportunities. So out of these things, unfortunately, these bad things, always comes these innovations that help us across the life sciences, across a host of diseases. HIV is really the reason why we have the great vaccine platforms we have today. What we learned about the immune system then now contributes to our ability to go faster. And unfortunately, or fortunately, what we learn from this will allow us to do more across all of healthcare in the future. And I think that I would encourage your members to stay committed to that mission.
No, I appreciate that, Phyllis. Andy, your final thoughts here today.
Yeah, I guess 2 quick points. One is I'd say, keep track of, follow as much as you can what's happening so that you can get plugged in and bring your, your capabilities to bear on this. Bio's work on setting up the matchmaking function in that hub is fantastic. I think we'll have more shortly on a contact for us for inbound inquiries to do something similar, right? We're doing that already with incoming. We just don't have it formally set up to do that same kind of matchmaking. People calling us every day saying, how can I help? Where do I plug in? And that's the second point I would make, and just a personal point, is to say, I think that what this pandemic response will really reinforce for us all nationally going forward is that no one company, no one hospital, not even a state can be an island when we think about how to respond going forward and for the next pandemic, which is we have to really work on the systems that tie things together much more efficiently, much faster, coordinate better, and figure out how to respond systemically, right? We have a lot of people responding very fast. A lot of hospitals have obviously, stepped up in a big way. Everyone's stepping up. The challenge is how do we all step up together and be better coordinated so that progress that we're making in 3 weeks could be made in 1 week. I think that's, something we all need to keep an eye on.
Well said.
Yes, I agree with that point. Phyllis, you agree?
Oh, definitely. I think that we're learning how much faster we can go if we work together and move some of the issues out of the way. I thoroughly agree with Andy on that.
Yes, and we are seeing that, and we are also working with our state partners and also you all on the national level. So again, we're so appreciative you're taking time. I know that many emails and questions and concerns are coming over through your desks and emails and phone calls. So again, we appreciate having you both leadership from the Bio organization at AdvaMed. Phyllis and Andy, I hope that you have a good rest of your days, and thanks for participating in this webinar. It's been very informative, and we hope we can get you reconvene again to see in maybe a month or so as the progress that's been made here as we all battle this coronavirus.
Happy to do so. This is a great opportunity to connect.
Yeah, thank you very much, and everyone stay healthy.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you both. And so again, I'm Erin Ford, Executive Vice President here at SCbio. We thank you for those of you that are tuning in live and those that are watching on a recording. We will have another issue of our webinar series, which will be happening next Friday at 10 a.m. and that is maintaining cybersecurity in the light of COVID-19. Anthony touched a little bit on those type of issues, and so we are happy to be featuring Delano Collins of Corsica Technologies, one of our board members here at SCbio. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we hope you all stay healthy and safe.